Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, hi, my name is Caitlin Elliott, and if you don't know who I am, I cover true crime cases on Tuesdays and Fridays, with my more vintage cases being posted on Fridays. If this is something that interests you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and hit that notification bell so that you never miss a video. So in my last video, we actually discussed the solved murder of Candy Rogers, which was solved back in 2021. And today we're going to be talking about another serial killer case, and this is the case of the Alphabet murders. So in Rochester, New York, back in 1970s, it wasn't exactly the best time to be a child. If you were a young child of around 11 to 12 years old, it became extremely unsafe to be alone. In just 2 years, 3 young Rochester area girls would disappear during the night, and each time their bodies would be discovered just a couple days later. Their bodies had been sexually assaulted and stabbed to death, and each girl had come from local poor Catholic families, had little to no friends, and had only disappeared just a couple blocks away from their homes. The last time the girls were ever seen alive was when they were walking away from their homes. During the 1990s, there was a detective named Detective Hazelwood who traveled to the Rochester Area Police Department to begin his own investigation into the case. The captain's name was Lynn Johnston, and he actually worked for the Rochester Police Department. And he handed over 30 years worth of materials about this case, dating back to the year of the murder. There was an intense fire in his chest and a strong desire to help solve this case, because it really disturbed him. He selected 3 different retired experts to come and help him with this case as they looked over the details. So let's begin with the murders. So the murders would begin on November 16th of 1971 with just a young girl who lived in the Rochester area and would constantly have nightmares. This little girl's name was Carmen Colon, and she was only 11 years old. Her mother was 16 years old when she gave birth to Carmen, and she was an only child. Despite her mother being 16 years old when she gave birth to Carmen, she had zero help raising the little girl. Carmen was said to be very slightly developmentally delayed, and this was involved with her brain. So this meant that even though she was 11 years old, she acted like she was still 7. She eventually ended up moving in with her grandparents in Rochester, New York, and would often run errands for them by herself. The neighborhood her family lived in was often referred to as Bullhead, and this was the same area where the store was located. So on November 16th of 1971, Carmen went to the pharmacy nearby to run an errand for her grandfather. She asked to get the medication for her grandfather, and when she mentioned that she needed to pick it up, the pharmacy informed her that the medication was not ready. This freaked Carmen out, and she started screaming on top of her lungs, "I gotta go, I gotta go." And she quickly turned around and bolted out of the store without getting her medication that she needed. So Carmen is described as a white female of Puerto Rican descent, 11 years old, and she had long brown hair and brown eyes. She was small for her age, and she only was 4 feet 3 inches tall and weighed 65 pounds. She had been in the 5th grade at this time and was wearing a red coat, blue slacks, and was considered to be part of the lower socioeconomical status. Carmen was said to be a very nervous and fidgety young girl, and often very hyper, who would often acted on edge. She acted like something was going to happen all the time. This behavior could explain why she acted the way she did in the pharmacy, but even though Carmen had been sent to the store at 4:20 p.m., she never returned home. Obviously, her grandparents were freaking out because they couldn't find their granddaughter that lived with them, and they eventually called the police. The police traveled to the store, and when they discovered about her bizarre behavior, they found out someone must have been waiting for Carmen outside, and that's why she panicked and left. So this person was said to possibly be her abductor as to why she acted nervous and fidgety, and why she said she needed the medication. Carmen was seen just one last time that same afternoon, walking around 5:30 p.m. alongside Interstate 490 West. This sighting was about 12 miles away from where she lived and where the last sighting prior to this occurred. So how did Carmen end up 12 miles away from her home? Like, it just doesn't make any sense. Carmen was then seen running away from a weird-looking car on the highway, and this same car rapidly backed up upon the shoulder, and as Carmen ran past the car with this young man inside, another man had witnessed the whole thing and was very disturbed about what he saw, so he called the police. In the man's witness reports, he stated that he was driving down the highways when he noticed a young girl just running down the highway, waving her arms around and screaming. So what's really important about this sighting was that it meant that Carmen's abductor had lost control of the situation and she was able to escape him for just a couple of moments. So this also meant that he was clearly not skilled in what he was doing and that she was able to escape, which if you were an abductor, you wouldn't want to happen. So for most abductors, if their captive escaped, they wouldn't try to go and chase them down and bring them back to the car, but this abductor did so. So it seemed like maybe she had seen his face and that she could possibly report this to the authorities, but unfortunately 2 days after Carmen's abduction, there were 2 young boys walking by Churchville, New York, and Churchville, New York is said to be about 13 miles away from Rochester and is a town of about 2,000 people back in the year of 2010, so it's a relatively small town. As these 2 boys were just walking around and hanging out for the day, they ended up stumbling upon the deceased body of Carmen Colon. Carmen's body was said to have dried blood on her lips and her hair, as well as being brutally raped and strangled to death. Authorities were absolutely baffled by how many people had seen Carmen escape and run, yet nobody had stopped to offer her help. In fact, there were some people who were trying to take her back to her abductor. So everyone in the entire Rochester community was just outraged that no one had stopped to help her and that this could have happened. And they were also terrified that their own children might possibly be next. In 1971, Rochester, no one could truly comprehend the evil action that had occurred. When it came to the city of Rochester, New York, a child murder or child abduction was said to be extremely rare, especially back then. No one could really understand why this poor innocent girl had been snatched off the streets and then ultimately murdered for seemingly no reason. Detective Hazelwood arrived at the scene of the crime and discovered that there was absolutely no bindings on her body, which meant that she had not been tied up whatsoever, which allowed her to escape that time. Carmen's abductor had actually kidnapped her, raped her, and then murdered her before dumping the girl's body in a way that made him seem like he didn't really care about her and what he had done. So it's so disturbing to me that, he seemed like he really needed to get this girl back, and for what though? That's what doesn't make any sense. So it was said an autopsy was ultimately done on her body, and it was said that her cause of death was determined to be manual strangulation. This meant that the killer, whoever he was, had looked Carmen in the face and strangled her with his own hands. So this murder really sent a ripple through the Rochester community, and they spent the last few months after Carmen Colon's death just moving on from it as a society. The Colon family was just absolutely astonished by the amount of support that they received from the local community, as 300 people, most who did not know Carmen or her family, attended the little girl's funeral. However, despite all the support, Carmen's grandparents were absolutely devastated about her death, as she was raised by them as if she was their own daughter. I'm not sure if Carmen was an only child, but it was said that she was raised by them. The second murder occurred in 1973, and this next victim's name was Wanda Walkowicz. Wanda was said to have had a pretty tough life back in her short 11 years of life. And Wanda's father unfortunately passed away when she was extremely young, so she didn't know him very well.
Radar.
So After the death of her father, Wanda's mother would move on and she couldn't work, and she ended up just getting a new boyfriend and allowed this boyfriend to move into her home with herself and Wanda. This boyfriend was said to have a criminal record and was pretty hefty. This criminal record was pretty hefty and involved a long history of mental illness as well. So Wanda was described as being a very rowdy child, and she was often fighting on her school playground. She would fight all these boys, she would fight people who were bigger than her, and she would just get in fistfights all the time with other children. If anyone tried to fight Wanda or bullied her, she would often fight back. She didn't really care, who they were. If it was a guy or a girl, she would defend herself. So Wanda was also said to have been extremely street smart and grew up knowing to never accept rides from strangers. On April 2nd of 1973, Wanda visited her neighborhood market on a trip to run some errands. She was supposed to be picking up groceries at the local market and return straight home so her mother could cook dinner for the family. Back during the early 1970s, it was not uncommon for parents to send their children by themselves to perform tasks. Some children would be as young as 6 years old, walking to the store by themselves to go pick up milk or eggs. So Wanda left the market around 4 p.m. that afternoon and started to make her way back home. She was last seen by witnesses heading north onto Congi Avenue with her arms stuffed full of groceries. A short time after Wanda's disappearance, a witness actually stated that he or she recalled seeing her walk around on Congi Avenue, not far from the market. Wanda's arms were said to be stuffed full of groceries, and she was struggling to carry it all by herself. So there was a car that was stopped on the side of the street, and they had their passenger door open. The person inside the car spoke to Wanda, and whatever they said made Wanda kind of just hesitate in front of the door. She knew that she should never accept a ride from strangers, but that's when the person inside offered her something pretty tempting. So she just sat there and was like, okay, I'll go in. She went inside the car. This was a different car. There was a different car that was driving by and noticed another vehicle stopped at a rest area that night off of Route 104 near Webster, New York. I've been to Webster, New York. It's really sends chills down my spine and down my arms, oh my God. So this driver was concerned when seeing the person inside that car toss something out of the car into the woods and just bolt off. So the person really didn't think anything of this. Maybe they thought it was trash. Maybe they just thought it was a blanket or something. They didn't really think that something could have happened. So the passerby just went on with their day. The following day, a New York State trooper was scouting the area and noticed something peculiar sticking out of the brush on Route 104 and went closer to investigate. He was horrified to stumble across the body of a young girl who was eventually identified as little Wanda Walkowicz. Just like sweet little Carmen, she had been brutally raped and was manually strangled to death. Wanda's family then felt a very intense grief just for the loss of their daughter and an intense fear for their own safety. It was possible whomever did this to Wanda could have known about the other family members and might try to target them next as well. So they were just terrified for their own lives. Her own cousin stated to reporters that she was now constantly fearful and looking over her shoulder, didn't want to go places by herself, and was just constantly nervous because of the death of her own cousin. For Roy Hazelwood of the Rochester Police Department, he really wanted to compare Wanda's murder to Carmen's. And when Roy looked into both cases, he realized that both cases involved a victim that was being dumped, as they call it, onto the side of the roads. However, Wanda was said to be much more clothed than Carmen was. So along with the difference between the cases, Wanda's strangulation was said to be completely different than Carmen's. It's possible that the killer, instead of using his hands, had possibly used a piece of rope or a cloth to strangle Wanda to death. She had also been fed during her abduction, while Carmen had not, but it's possible that the killer had evolved during his second abduction. He decided he was going to do different techniques to try to lure people into his trap. So Wanda was stated to have several pieces of white cat hairs on her clothing, which struck her family as odd because they did not own a white cat. So the detectives believe that it's possible that the abductor may have brought this cat with him and used it along with food as a way to coerce her inside the car. Once seeing the cat and the food, Wanda could have felt comfortable enough, thinking nothing about the situation, entered the car, and just felt like it was a perfect opportunity to just get some food and hang out with this cat, I guess. I don't know. Both Wanda and Carmen actually coincidentally came from lower income families, and they were both disposed of right outside of Rochester, New York. So if you don't know, Rochester, New York is like an enormous city. I'm talking it's huge. And it's over by Lake Ontario and Niagara Falls. So it's like way up north. So it has a lot of suburbs. It has a lot of like local communities and local neighborhoods, that would often be referred to as, the Rochester area. Authorities are starting to take notice of what's going on, and they begin to think that something is seriously wrong and something wrong is going on. So they were stunned by a connection in the cases that they hadn't even noticed about, and this involved the names of the victims, Carmen Colon and Wanda Walkowicz. Their first and last names both started with the same letter. So even the public, they noticed this, and they were starting to get really concerned for their own safety. So if this wasn't compelling enough, Carmen's body was said to be discovered in Churchville, New York, and Wanda's was discovered in Webster, New York. So at this point, police noticed this as well. So you've got WWW and then CCC. So they've become extremely concerned that there might possibly be a serial killer on the loose in the state. And this serial killer was someone who was obsessed with people that have the same names. And this was very frightening for the community, especially when it came to parents of young children, especially little girls. So many families were extremely concerned with the safety of their children, and they would not allow their children to go anywhere without adult supervision. Some families were said to have been so terrified that their children could possibly be next that they packed up all of their belongings and they left the entire state. They said, nope, left. So the police even sent out choppers through the air to try to get an aerial view of this killer doing whatever he needed to do and see if they could catch him in the act and possibly arrest him and charge him with the murders of Wanda and Carmen. But this never happened. So by the fall of 1973, the murder of Wanda Walkowicz had started a massive investigation into what possibly could have happened to her once she was killed. This was done in hopes of being able to prevent yet another tragedy, but despite all of this, there was not a single arrest at this point. So this was becoming extremely upsetting to the society, and the authorities believed that no one wanted this to continue. But with no arrests, there really wasn't anything they could do, and there could be more murders of children. Police believed that someone out there knew something, but they wanted a specific person to come forward with information about who could be doing this. Also, what was really bothersome was that these two girls were killed in unique towns. Carmen was killed in Chile, New York, and Wanda was killed in Webster, New York, which was really bizarre and could be considered clues in their murders. So another point to bring up was that the killer was targeting young girls. And these young girls had double initials with the same letter. He could have possibly stalked his victims for a while and then decided to plan these abductions targeting these specific victims from low-income families. It's quite possible that he also had some type of weird fetish going on for young girls, and it's disgusting to say that. Like, I understand people have their own, sexual preferences, but It's just weird if you're attracted to a child. It's disgusting and it's weird. End of story. So 6 months after poor innocent Wanda was murdered, it would happen yet again. So Michelle was a very kind and young girl. Her name was Michelle Maenza, and she was 11 years old, and she was very kind, and she was a very shy girl who was often bullied by her peers, which is just so mean. Like, why would you bully people? People out there bully others for, like, no reason. So the Monday prior to Thanksgiving of 1973, Michelle went to go visit her school nurse that day, and she was just crying and just devastated over these bullies and how they were treating her. So once she calmed down, the nurse, they just allowed her to go home, and she left the school, and she made her way towards the market to run some errands for her mom. Michelle was last seen walking in the direction of the market before she vanished without a single witness to the abduction. Not long after she went missing, there was actually a call to the authorities from a woman claiming that she could have possibly have seen Michelle at a local hamburger stand. So Michelle, she was in this car, according to the witness, and watched the man that had driven the car return to her with a bag of burgers and a cup that had a drink in it. She was described by her family as very naive, trusting, friendly, shy, and easily startled. So because of this, it's possible that this may have unfortunately placed Michelle as a target for the mysterious serial killer. If she had been bullied that day by her peers, it's quite possible the abductor may have noticed her in a very distressed and upset state and could have, preyed on her, just like, hey, I understand that you're having a hard day. Why don't you come in my car? We'll go pick up some burgers. Had the cat with him, it's a possibility. So later that evening, the Maenza family, they were really upset because their daughter Michelle never came home from school, and they were really alarmed, and they were worried that something could have happened. So they reported her missing to the authorities. Right away, they thought that this disappearance could possibly be related to the abductions and the murders of both Carmen and Wanda, so this was extremely alarming for them. A few days after her abduction, a man that was driving on a country road, like it was a back road, quiet, there wasn't a lot of traffic, and he's just driving by when he notices something out of his eye, and this was right outside of the town of Rochester, New York. So he pulled his truck over, and he decided to get out and investigate what exactly it was that he saw lying on the side of the road. This man was then absolutely stunned beyond belief to see the deceased body of a young girl. I mean, honestly, I don't think whenever we're driving down the interstate, we expect to see a dead body. I mean, maybe a dead deer, but not a dead human, especially a child. So obviously this shook him up a lot, and he was panicking, he was just horrified, and he called the police immediately. So the police were arriving on the scene as quickly as possible, and they decided to look over the little girl's body and figure out who this girl could possibly be. And that was when this girl was then identified positively as Michelle Maenza, the girl that had been missing. So everyone in the Rochester area was said to be absolutely horrified because for the third time in 2 years, a young girl had just been brutally murdered. When the authorities looked into the case, they were shocked to realize that Michelle's abduction and murder was almost the exact same way that Wanda's had been done. Along with the similarities, though, there were a lot of differences compared to Michelle's case and the murders of the other two previous girls. So Michelle's case and Wanda's were practically exact, even down to the fact that they had been strangled with a rope while Carmen had been manually strangled. Also, the last two girls were found to be fully clothed while Carmen was found nude, and she had been raped as well. There was a huge important detail in Michelle's case that made it almost identical to the first two, and that's what was that her initials actually matched, just like the others. Hers was MM. So there was CC, there was WW, and MM. So it was after the murder that the killer of all three girls was then dubbed as the alphabet murderer. So according to eyewitness reports, it was said that Michelle was last seen alive at the burger joint the day she was abducted alongside a man that had dirty hands. So this sighting was said to be extremely significant to the case because this abductor had kidnapped this little girl and took her out to eat just like Wanda, except the fact that he had showed a very complex personality. Also, the fact that Wanda and Michelle were fed shows exactly how the killer worked emotionally. He seemed to have like a very paternal-like bond towards his victims, but he also seemed to be like a very cold and calculating killer, so he planned this move to make him seem like he was kind of like a fatherly figure, and this would cause the victim to trust their abductor or their killer. Is this considered a sign of endearment, or is this considered like a cold, sadistic move? I personally think it's a sadistic move to feed your victims, to get them to trust you, and then you go and kill them. So when the killer disposed of Michelle's body out in the open, it was strange because he had 3 different options of placement. Like, they were said to have been like a stream that was nearby, there were fields, and as you guys watched my last video, I've talked about how you can take a body, put them in streams, and they will float down the river, never to be seen again. And this can lead, like I said, they can lead a body away from the crime scene. So, to authorities at the time, it was unclear as to why he had such a bizarre strategy with his crimes. As the 1970s era came to a close, the Rochester Police Department were nowhere close to arresting a suspect for the murders of the little girls. And this was back in 1971, 1972, and 1973. So, however, in 1979, there was a very promising suspect who came forward into the spotlight as a possible criminal behind the murders in Rochester. When the infamous Hillside Stranglers were out and about, they were arrested in California, and it was discovered that Kenneth Bianchi, I believe that's how you pronounce his name, was actually from Rochester, New York, and was said to have even lived there during the times of the murders, and he strangled his victims. Because of this information, authorities traveled to where he was being held at and decided to question him about the Alphabet murders. However, when it came to the Hillside Stranglers versus the Alphabet Killer, there were some similarities and there were also some differences. The most important difference was that the Hillside Strangler targeted grown women, especially prostitutes, and the Alphabet Killer targeted young girls between the ages of 10 and 12 years old, and they were mostly of the lower income families. According to authorities, it's extremely rare to be a serial killer that targets young girls in a brutal and sexual manner like that. When it comes to serial killers, most of them, like I said, target young women, especially prostitutes that are in their 20s. But this killer was different because he had an obsession with small children, primarily the young girls. As the detectives analyzed the body of little Michelle, there was actually a palm print obtained, and this palm print led authorities to completely rule out Kenneth Bianchi as the killer. So he was not the killer because his palm print did not match at all. In the 1990s, there was a semen particle that was discovered on one of the young girls' bodies, and this was then submitted to the lab to do a DNA analysis and create a possible genetic fingerprint for the killer. The police would then use this fingerprint to compare with possible suspects in the case. After this was created, a scientist then created a model neighborhood with a possible home of where the suspect could live in. Along with this, it would help locate local sex offenders in the area, get them questioned, and figure out whether or not they knew the girls or possibly could have been behind it. Authorities were able to locate the killer's neighborhood, and once this was established, a profile based off of the traits of the killer and his neighborhood was created. The forensic scientists then tried to determine the behavior of this killer, uncovering something very interesting about the victims. They were about 10, 11, and 11, so they're around preteen age, and they had been abducted, raped, and then strangled to death. And all 3 girls had the same initials. It's possible that the abductor was obsessed with the 3 girls due to their matching initials, thus stalking them to learn about their roots and being able to get them to trust them enough so that he could snatch them. However, the authorities considered the fact that there might not be just one killer, there might be more than one, since Carmen's body was actually hidden and was left nude, while the other two were left clothed and out in the open. Despite this, it's also quite possible he might have just added clothes to the bodies after he killed them in order to dispose of them that way. And what's even more weird is that his last two victims were fed prior to the murders, but Carmen was not fed. Despite a majority of possible suspects being dismissed, there was one main suspect that authorities narrowed down, and this was a man named Michael Colon, who was Carmen's uncle. Authorities believe that Carmen's uncle named Michael could have been behind her murder, and when he was questioned about it, he was said to not have had a good alibi for what he was doing on the day of Carmen's murder. Of course, we know that polygraph tests and everything, they're not accurate. So this made the detectives extremely suspicious of Michael Colon, and they decided to travel to his home to go and speak to him. However, when they tried to find Michael, he stepped out to the front of his door, pulled out a gun, and shot himself to death in the head. So his son, Miguel, who was Carmen's cousin, claimed that their father would not and could not ever do anything like that to his niece. And this Uncle Michael, like I said, he was so devastated when the police came up and accused him and brought him to the station and everything that he back in 1991, he pulled out a gun and he shot himself in the head. After his suicide, the authorities were able to compare Carmen's killer's DNA and the DNA to her uncle, and it was proven to not be a match. Authorities still believe that her killer was different than the other two girls, also believing that he had a very violent temper which caused him to act impulsively and erratically. However, a majority of people believe that the alphabet killer was just one single serial killer, and all three victims had matching initials, and their bodies were also disposed of in a town that started with the exact same initials. I mean, that can't just be a coincidence. This person had to have planned this all out and stalked his victims somehow. What's even more haunting was that an unknown person was said to have traveled to Wanda's gravesite and would go there every day, cleaning off her tombstone and laying fresh flowers there every single day. Despite all of this happening, it was announced that according to her family, no one in relation to Wanda Walkowicz was responsible for this. This is super creepy because it meant that a stranger could have been traveling to her grave and just put those flowers there. I mean, like, who would want to go to a grave of an 11-year-old little girl every day and place flowers? Like, it's so weird. Maybe it was the killer, maybe he felt remorse, but we don't really know. There was just a huge update in this case last month in April of 2022, and this began with a woman on TikTok. This woman posted a video in early April stating that how she believed that her own grandfather was the one behind the alphabet murders. Alexis, the woman, posted the video in early April and it went viral immediately. She claimed that her own aunt was very good friends with Wanda Walkowicz and her grandfather actually knew Wanda pretty well. What's even more compelling is that the eyewitness claimed that the grandfather actually drove a brown station wagon, and this was what the abductor was said to drive around in, was a brown station wagon. So each victim was also found with white cat furs on their clothing, with the exception of Carmen Colon, who was nude. And the woman's grandfather actually owned several white cats and let them ride around in the car as well, just like the cats that had been in the car that Wanda was coerced into. He was said to have been on the official suspects list during the investigation and was the first person to offer a cash reward, even claiming that an unidentified body of a child that had been found weeks prior, like whenever they found the body, he said that this body was Wanda Walkowicz, and that was before that there was a confirmation saying that for fact this was Wanda's body. So it's just really weird. As of May 2022, the case has never been reopened and still remains unsolved. I would love to know what you guys think about this case down below in the comments section. Do you guys think these cases are all connected? Do you think that Carmen's is different from everyone else's? Do you think that the girl's grandfather may have been the one behind the killings, or was it just a coincidence and was someone else entirely behind it? Don't forget to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and subscribe to my channel. Until next time, I'll see you guys later.